Well, Merry Christmas, Westside. So the Aucas of Ecuador were called the worst people on earth in Time magazine, 1956. I mean, you gotta be pretty bad to earn that title, right? Well, how does a tribe get to be called the worst people on earth? Well, for starters, what you need to do is you need to hate all strangers. Everybody outside your tribe, hate them. And then you live only to hunt, to fight, and to kill. The Aucas didn't really produce much except for 9-foot-long spears that they used for killing other humans. Their neighboring tribe, the Javaros, were not exactly the cuddly type themselves. They were famous for headhunting and shrinking human heads, things like that. And so they lived in constant fear of the Aucas. These Aucas were a murderous people. 74% of the Auca men died through tribal warfare. They, of course, felt it their duty to avenge the murder of their relatives by spearing the killers, or, of course, any member of the killer's family. And so even distant cousins weren't safe from these revenge murders. Preventative murders were also a thing for the Aucas. If an Auca suspected that you held a grudge against him or one of his family members, he would be sure to try to take you out first before you could get your revenge on his family. They were a murderous bunch to those outside their tribe and to those within their tribe. When one of their own got sick or old, his relatives dug a pit underneath his hammock, toppled him in, and buried him alive. I know, yeah. The women often killed their baby girls, so population was obviously a problem. The Aucas killed for sport, for lust, for jealousy, or just out of simple irritation. One Auca man speared both his friend's wife and his mother to death as a joke. Merry Christmas, everybody. No tribe can survive those cycles of revenge and self-destruction for very long. Without a doubt, this tribe was bound for extinction, total self-destruction. So would you believe it if I told you that those worst people on planet Earth now live at peace with their own and with others? 5 Christian missionary men were convinced that if they could just get the Aucas to learn about Jesus, this tribe would surrender their spears and flourish. So in 1956, these 5 missionaries made contact with the tribe. And the exchanges at first were quite friendly, but after a tragic misunderstanding, it turned murderous in an instant. And after spearing these 5 missionaries, the Auca warriors crept back into the jungle to await the massive retaliation that they were thoroughly trained to expect at this point. But the retaliation never came. Instead, what came a couple years later were 2 of the widows. At the risk of their own lives, these missionary women began a relationship with the Auca women, learning their language, ministering to their needs, teaching them about the peace found only in Jesus, and eventually ministering to the very men who killed their husbands. Eventually transforming this tribe's seemingly inescapable cycles of revenge and self-destruction into what the Bible calls peace. Peace is what the Bible calls that. Shalom is the Hebrew word used throughout the Old Testament. Shalom is a big word, referring not just to the absence of war, absence of conflict, but actually the presence of something that's been missing. Adding something back in to the mix in order to restore this thing into wholeness, into completion. Shalom is the kind of peace that comes from being made whole, made complete. So shalom is typically used of things that are very complex, having many parts that are supposed to work together. And when it's missing a part, or when part of it is out of alignment or out of harmony with the rest of its components, it is longing for shalom. It's longing for wholeness, completeness. Your life is very complex. So many parts to your life, right? There are parts of it that are missing, out of harmony, out of alignment with the whole. And you might find yourself longing for shalom. Maybe in your home. It's very complex. Lots of parts. Exponentially more complex with each creature that lives there. Have you noticed this? And when those creatures are not living in harmony with one another, you might find yourself longing for shalom. Perhaps in your marriage or your relationship with your significant other. Perhaps that's longing for shalom. And when you find it, that doesn't mean that you simply just stop fighting. It's not just an absence of conflict. No, shalom means that you start actually working together for each other's benefit. You restore the thing that's missing. You restore kindness and generosity to the relationship. What has been missing is now supplied, and so it's whole. When your relationship to those outside of your tribe is one of disharmony, defined by fear and outrage and contempt, shalom isn't just eliminating the outrage and the contempt. It's a good place to start. But shalom is beginning to trust, to serve, to provide for, even to protect and defend those outside your tribe. From the ancient Hebrews in the Old Testament to the Christians in the New Testament, the Bible's hope has always been that someday God will completely shalom his entire creation, supplying what's missing. The day when God makes everything right, when war and conflict become a thing of the past, oppression and exploitation get replaced with justice and honor, when sadness turns to joy, and when God turns grieving to dancing. Whew, we're a long way from that day, aren't we? Sheesh, I can't even find a little peace and shalom in my home on most days, you know what I mean? How in the world is God going to get his whole creation to that point? Well, let's bring Isaiah into this conversation, shall we? He's got a lot to say about it. Isaiah is the prophet in the Old Testament that our teaching series has been drawing from these last few weeks. Isaiah prophesied about 700-ish years before Jesus during an incredibly tumultuous time in Israel's history. Do you know anything about tumultuous times? To put it nicely, the nation's leadership, not killing it. It wasn't doing very well. I mean, you had a few good leaders mixed into the recent history, but for the most part, the nation's leaders had been leading their people away from obedience and loyalty and faithfulness to God down some really bad paths for several generations. So Israel's enemies were various. She had enemy forces coming at her from outside and from within her own population. The nation of Israel itself was divided into two kingdoms, right? The north and the south. And when Isaiah's prophesying, the one in the north is in the process of conspiring with another nation to come down and wipe out the southern kingdom. So this people is divided and on the verge of civil war. So the southern kingdom, that's where Jerusalem was at. That's where Isaiah was at. Southern kingdom is pretty shaken. It thinks it knows what's coming. But Isaiah says, hey, don't worry. The northern kingdom is not going to wipe us out. Because God is going to use Assyria, that's the brutal military superpower in the northeast. He's going to use Assyria to wipe out the northern kingdom before they're able to attack us here in the south. And Assyria will move southward and they'll threaten us here in the south, but they won't take us completely. They won't take Jerusalem. Because, eventually they will get taken out by Babylon, another superpower, right? Babylon's got to take them out. And then, of course, Babylon will come in and take us out here in the south and lead us all into exile. So don't worry, right? Isaiah says all this is because of our disobedience and idolatry. And there was a point when we could have repented, we could have turned and corrected our ways, But we're beyond that point. Our hearts are hardened to the point where we can't repent. We're beyond the point of no return. And so now God is going to use the Assyrians and the Babylonians to punish us for and purify us of our disobedience and idolatry. Now, if I just lost you a little bit, that's okay. Here's the bottom line. Isaiah is prophesying at a time of fear and self-inflicted chaos. Not a lot of shalom going on in Isaiah's time, right? You know anything about times like that? Well, that's the world that Isaiah is living in. That's the world that he's speaking into. And given all of Israel's external conflicts at the time, I'm sure it looked like a lack of shalom between Israel and other nations. Given all the internal conflicts, the oppression, the injustice, I'm sure it looked like a lack of shalom between, these two kingdoms, and even a lack of shalom with these factions within each kingdom, between, say, the rich and the poor, for example. But Isaiah is reminding his people that their problems are essentially, at their core, due to a lack of shalom with their God. This is the God that they've been cheating on with all their other priorities, the God that they've been rebelling against, the God that they've been wronging for years. They have made an enemy out of their God. And restoring shalom with him will require something that they cannot produce within themselves. Their hearts are too hard. It must be provided by God himself. And so Isaiah says, good news. That day is coming. That day of shalom is coming. Peace with God, peace with all nations. God's going to supply what's missing. He's going to make everything right. He's going to put all priorities in their proper place. Weapons can be permanently disposed of. Other nations will become brothers and sisters. A time of never-ending peace on earth. It's coming. And how will God get us there? What is it that God will supply in order to get us to that point? A leader, a Messiah, a leader. Oh? Well, what kind of leader could that possibly be? What in the world kind of leader could possibly usher in that kind of never-ending peace? How do you achieve peace in your home? Put a bark collar on your dog, stick the kids in front of the screen. That'll work for a minute. How do you achieve peace in your marriage? Just shut up. Might not be a bad place to start, actually. Maybe you leave, put your headphones on, you escape the conflict. Does that work? For a minute? For a minute. My temptation when siblings are quarreling or there's some other kind of chaos in my home, my tendency is to power up, raise my voice, get angry, use my strength to regain control of the chaos, use my power to coerce everyone into alignment, force unity, right? If you're not going to be peaceful with each other, I'm going to make it peaceful in here, right? Yeah, that works about as well as you would expect it to, which is to say it doesn't. Peace by coercive force. See, we've seen that a few times in human history, haven't we? That's how the Roman emperors achieved a couple hundred years of peace throughout Rome. Pax Romana, right? Peace via military persuasion, right? Conquer all your enemies with power, force them into alignment, and voila, peace. Oh yeah, that'll work for a minute. But what about a peace that endures beyond just a minute of human history? How could we possibly get to a state of lasting peace? And what on earth kind of leader could possibly get us there? You would expect Isaiah's vision of this Messiah, to describe the Messiah, God with us, in the form of a strong military leader, a heavenly king whose power is unmatched. First, using his power to avenge Israel's enemies, then strong-arming everybody else into alignment. I mean, come on, how else is God going to deliver his people from all of the arrogance of other nations, all the war, the oppression, all the coercion of other nations? Well, of course, he's going to send a leader who's more arrogant, more bloodthirsty, more oppressive, and because he is the most powerful, more effectively coercive than everybody else. That's how we'll do it. And when the biggest gorilla on the planet wins, voila, peace on earth, right? You would expect Isaiah's Messiah to be this dominating figure, overpowering everything and everyone who is against peace. But Isaiah's visions don't foresee a big gorilla. What they foresee repeatedly is a child, a baby. As if this all-powerful God, who could eliminate all of his enemies, all his people's enemies in an instant, puts the plan of world peace on the shoulders of an infant. The epitome of weakness and vulnerability. Maybe because eliminating his enemies isn't ultimately God's goal. God's preference is to turn enmity into friendship whenever possible. That's his preference. And so in chapter 7, Isaiah sees a baby born to a young girl. And then in chapter 11, it's a vision of a young child leading both a lamb and a wolf forward. A lion and a calf leading them forward. And then there's a vision of an infant playing near the cobra's den. And then a toddler sticking his hand in a nest of vipers. Unharmed, unafraid. And then, of course, the vision that we've been looking at the past few weeks here in Isaiah chapter 9. He says, "For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. And his government and its peace will never end." And I bet you know where the story goes from here. Sure enough, about 700 years later, Luke says, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. Now, a census, of course, is the emperor's way of establishing who owes him taxes. Roman occupation and oppression and coercion is in the background of the story. The whole census business meant that Joseph and pregnant Mary had to travel back to Bethlehem. That's Joseph's ancestral hometown where he had to check in. And while they were there in Bethlehem, the time came for her baby to be born. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth, rags, and laid him in a manger. That's a feeding trough for animals. And she did this, of course, because there was no lodging available for them in the inn. And in some fields, not too far away from this scene, there were some shepherds watching over their sheep, and the night sky suddenly broke open. And an angel appeared to them with the message of very, very good news. The Savior, the Messiah, this leader that you have been longing for. He's arrived. The Lord himself has arrived. And you're going to find him in Bethlehem, wrapped in rags, lying in a feeding trough. And then all heaven broke loose. And this whole army of angels appeared, and they praised God, saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace on earth to those with whom God is pleased." God's shalom has come to the earth, to those God's pleased with. Now, don't hear that last line, that last phrase, as an exclusive kind of thing. It's not exclusive. This is rather a universal kind of thing. Saying God is demonstrating his pleasure with the whole earth, his favor, his blessing on the whole world by sending his shalom. It's all evidenced in this gift he's giving to the world. You could actually summarize the whole Christian story in this way. Although we were God's enemies, he has extended peace to us in Jesus. And so when Jesus arrives, it is God's gift of shalom that is arriving. It's beginning to arrive in his creation. This is unbelievably good news. This is absolutely a joy to the world. So yeah, go tell it from the mountaintops. Absolutely. God has supplied the thing that we could not possibly supply for ourselves. He's provided this way back to shalom with him. But there is tragedy ahead, isn't there? This shalom comes in a package that many will not recognize. Maybe it's, because we expected peace to come in the form of an overpowering military strength, a strong arm seeking to coerce and control the chaos. Maybe that's what we were looking for, somebody to force all of the pieces into alignment, into harmony. Maybe it's our own internal attraction to power, our addiction to maintaining control. For whatever reason, we can miss peace when she's standing right in front of us, can't we? Have you ever noticed this about peace? She never goes where she's not welcomed. She's not a control freak. She's not a tyrant. She's not coercive in any way. She simply offers a gentle invitation, always an invitation. And then she waits. You know what makes an all-powerful God sad? You know what makes Jesus cry, what made him cry? I might not have noticed this myself if my dad hadn't pointed this out to me, but the Gospels only mention 2 times that specific where Jesus cries, where he weeps. The most well-known of these 2 is in John 11. Jesus is looking at the tomb where his friend Lazarus, who had just died 4 days ago, was. And even though Jesus knows that this story will not end in death, even though he knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead here in a moment, bring him back to life, Jesus was still moved to tears in that moment. As if when Jesus was present with those who were grieving, Jesus wept. That's what John says. Man, you could spend a whole sermon right there on those 2 words right there, couldn't you? And it's worth mentioning that the word that John uses for weep there means to cry quietly. The only other time in the Gospels that mention Jesus weeping, Jesus isn't crying quietly, he's crying loudly. It's in Luke chapter 19. It's Jesus' final trip to Jerusalem. He knows the cross is coming. And he's approaching the city of Jerusalem. You might even say he is finally arriving. And just before he gets to Jerusalem, he goes through a couple towns, a couple small villages. And when he goes through, the people there give him an appropriately royal welcome. Okay? Now, he's going through their village on a donkey, not a stallion like any sensible king would ride in on. It's not even a full-grown donkey. It's a young donkey. It's a colt. He's riding on a colt. And he isn't surrounded by chariots and a battalion of weaponry and soldiers, symbolic, of course, of military strength, like any sensible king of that time would. No. Jesus is surrounded by the formerly leprous and lame, symbolic of a God who is strong enough to overcome enmity through his very weakness. And these people are welcoming him as a king. Now, it's just a remnant of these followers, of these disciples. It's not a lot of them, but they're doing it right, man. They are welcoming him as the king that he is. They know who he is. And so they're lining the streets. They're laying down their coats on the road in order to, honor the path that he's taking through their village. They know who he is. And so they are at the top of their lungs, shouting, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." That line is familiar to his first arrival. And then he comes around the corner, goes through these villages, comes around the corner, and boom, there it is, Jerusalem. This city, the city with a history with God. This city that had been besieged by Assyria, wiped out by Babylon 700 years prior, then, of course, sacked and desecrated a couple hundred years before this, then tossed around like a rag doll between whomever had been in power ever since, now sitting under the oppressive rule of the Roman Empire. And sadly, their destruction has always been self-inflicted. Jerusalem has always suffered because they failed to embrace God's way to peace. They rejected his way to shalom. And now, Jesus is looking at Jerusalem knowing they're about to do it again. And it breaks him. It breaks his heart. Luke tells the story in this way. It says, as Jesus came closer to Jerusalem, saw the city ahead, he began to weep aloud. How I wish today that you of all people would understand the way to peace. But now it's too late. Your hearts are hard, and peace is hidden from your eyes. Your hearts are hardened, and you couldn't recognize divine shalom if he were to reach out and slap you in the face. He's right in front of you, and you're going to miss him because of your hearts. And through the tears in his eyes, he can see into the future. And he says, before long, which ended up only being about 40 years, before long, your enemies, the Romans, will build ramparts against your walls and encircle you and close in on you from every side. They will crush you into the ground and your children with you. Your enemies will not leave a single stone in place because you did not recognize it when God visited you. All this because they didn't recognize it when God was right there with them. Man, could anything be worse than that? Anything worse than missing the God who is with you? Anything worse than God coming to you? You know, the solution to all of your problems, the comfort to all the chaos, the strongest refuge from all of your truest enemies. Peace himself comes to you into your city, knocks on your door, and you miss him. You answer the door, but you don't recognize him because you're so wrapped up in what? Trying to solve your own problems in your own ways, trying to power up and control the chaos around you, trying to eliminate your enemies, things that oppose you and your way. And Shalom himself is standing at your door and you don't even recognize him. Could anything be more heartbreaking, more tragic than that? We live in a world longing for shalom. And those who have received this peace that God has extended to the earth in Jesus are uniquely equipped to extend that peace to the world. I like this picture. It's going to come up on the screen. It's a picture of Steve and Minkaye. Steve's father was one of the 5 missionaries slain in Ecuador. Minkaye was one of the killers. Minkaye, the transformation of the whole tribe is remarkable, but what has happened here in this relationship between Steve and Minkaye, I think, is particularly beautiful. Minkaye has adopted Steve as his tribal son. And Steve's kids refer to Minkaye as their grandfather. You wrap your brain around that, will you? See, this is the paradox of God's peace. It's precisely the one in position, precisely the one with the moral right to take back what's his, overwhelming his enemies with power and might and strength. That's the one who instead chooses to overcome his enemies through humility and weakness. And this is the way that God turns enmity into friendship, into lasting peace. And that's why he comes to us as one wrapped in rags and lying in a manger because there was no room for him in the inn. That's why he comes to us as one riding in on a young donkey instead of a stallion. And of course, most profoundly, that's why he comes to us as one hanging on a cross, establishing for us a shalom with God we couldn't possibly have achieved for ourselves. In the chaos of this Christmas season, in the chaos of this world that we're living in, you might be tempted to miss him, I'm sure, this week. You're going to have opportunities to get miffed at people, short, impatient, maybe even a little hostile with those in your family, maybe those outside of your tribe. These are his gentle invitations that he's extending to you. So don't miss them. He is inviting you into his way of peace, that you might receive him once again as Savior and as Lord, and then go share him with this world that is longing for peace.